When most of us think of Jean-Michel Basquiat, we picture this tragic street artist, right? The wild child of the 1980s New York art scene who just burned too bright and died way too young. But in this explainer, we're going to see how that narrative actually completely misses the point. We're going beyond the myth to decode the true Basquiat, not as some primitive graffiti bomber, but as a brilliant conceptual alchemist, a master who literally manipulated time, language, and art history to create some of the most profound intellectual codices of the entire 20th century.
Now, to set the stage for all this, think about this wonderfully provocative joke made by art critic René Ricard back in 1981. He famously wrote, "I'd rather have a Jean-Michel than a Cy Twombly. I want my home to look like a pile of junk to burglars." It's funny, but it really forces us to ask a fascinating question. How exactly did a teenager who was spray painting the walls of Manhattan buildings become this intellectual titan whose so-called junk is now revered as high art, literally worth millions of dollars?
Section 1. The Myth of Samo. So Basquiat's life was incredibly intense and tightly compressed. He was born in Brooklyn in 1960 to a Haitian father and a Puerto Rican mother, growing up in a middle-class, albeit troubled household. By 1978, he'd left home for good, just completely immersing himself in the emerging hip-hop and downtown scene. And then just 2 years later, he largely abandoned street walls for the canvas, and boom, his meteoric rise begins. By 1984, he's at the absolute height of his career, but he's also dealing with predatory dealers and this growing intense paranoia. Tragically, this brilliant run ends in 1988 with a fatal heroin overdose. He was just 27 years old.
But where this whole journey started was the Samo tag. Coined in 1978 with his friend Al Diaz, it stood for same old shit. But you have to understand, this wasn't your typical graffiti. This was his early foray into street poetics. They were tagging Manhattan with these witty, aphoristic phrases. Things like pay for soup, build a fort, set it on fire. It acted as a badge of anonymity and cynicism, brilliantly infused with his totally paradoxical copyright symbol. It was essentially public poetry operating as a full-on manifesto against the elite art establishment.
Section 2. Decoding the pseudo-gibberish.
Okay, so to actually decode his canvases, we really have to understand a term coined by his contemporary, Keith Haring: pseudo-gibberish. Haring used this to describe Basquiat's completely unique visual language, noting that Basquiat literally used words like paint. See, his work is essentially an exploded collage. To Basquiat, words, symbols, and images were all completely interchangeable vehicles of knowledge transfer. So while it might look chaotic to the untrained eye, it's actually a brilliantly controlled, meticulously synthesized code.
And that code is perfectly at work in his 1984 masterpiece, Famous Moon King. Now, at first glance, it might just look like a vast painterly heap of cultural refuse. But if you really break it down, you'll notice how Basquiat deliberately layers these darkly filled-in figures over a chaotic background of interpenetrative vignettes. You've got stick figures, floating body parts, words, and symbols all clashing together. It operates on this complex logic of accumulation and appropriation, which actually mirrors the hoarding practices of the dispossessed and the eclectic, vibrant nature of diaspora culture itself.
So the absolutely crucial point here is how we go about decoding these specific layers. In Famous Moon King, we find mythic representations of the body where the insides and outsides exist on a single flattened plane. We're talking visible lungs, skulls, and snarling teeth overlapping dark silhouettes. Then there's this incredible hermaphroditic, bird-faced sacred figure that completely transcends rational human and animal divisions. He's also directly pulling appropriated imagery from ancient Zimbabwean cave paintings. And then he embeds these absurdly arcane words, like ek pyrosis, an ancient Greek term signifying the fiery destruction of the cosmos. It's not just paint, it's an incredibly dense intellectual codex.
And if we really zoom in on his technique, you start to see his absolute mastery of the palimpsest. He uses a method called sgraffito, which basically means scratching directly through the wet paint to reveal the hidden layers right beneath it. So you have these seemingly childish doodles crashing head-on into ancient Greek concepts. It creates this witty, intentional failure to communicate, where elusive symbols conform to a primal instinct of mark-making that goes way, way beyond standard realism.
Section 3. The Elegant Clochard.
Now, during his life, the art world had this highly problematic fascination with Basquiat. They loved viewing him as the quote-unquote true voice of the ghetto. One dealer even described his affected elegance as that of a clochard, a homeless beggar, who lights up a magot with his pinky raised. They desperately wanted to pigeonhole him as this primitive, instinctual graffiti bomber. But the aesthetic reality? It's entirely different. Basquiat was a deeply conceptual intellectual. He was a multi-conscious alchemist working in incredibly complex neo-expressionist and Afro-surrealist frameworks. And we can actually see this aesthetic reality crystal clear when we examine famous Moon King alongside Ernst Ludwig Kirchner's 1908 painting Street Dresden. This absolutely proves his alignment with neo-expressionism. Both works share a distinct representational paranoia. Basquiat is tapping into that exact same interplay of exuberance and menace, blending the supernatural with sharp social critique, just exactly like the German expressionists did decades earlier.
To further cement his art historical mastery, consider the connection to Jackson Pollock's stenographic figure from 1942. The pseudo-representational, calligraphic nature of Pollock's work bears a really striking resemblance to Basquiat's own symbolic, humanoid shorthand. Basquiat wasn't just a kid from the streets. He was engaging directly with the spiritual automatism of abstract expressionism and actively pushing the entire movement forward.
Section 4. Mastering Space and Time.
Basquiat often framed himself as a griot, or perhaps even more accurately as an exu, which is the trickster deity in Afro-Atlantic religions who literally stands at the crossroads of the physical and metaphysical worlds. For Basquiat, the canvas itself became that exact intersection. It was a physical place where ancient myth, modern science, and his own personal history could all collide at exactly the same time.
And he navigated this complex crossroads using a concept scholars call Creole time. This is a unique temporality created by blending and simplifying totally different cultural histories. We're talking his Haitian and Puerto Rican roots, mainland Black culture, and Western art history. By synthesizing all of these elements into a single, unquantized visual rhythm, Basquiat could literally traverse time and space, completely rejecting a singular, rigid Eurocentric view of history.
He achieved this time travel through some very specific temporal signatures. For example, he constantly used the three-point crown to elevate Black icons, legends like Charlie Parker and Miles Davis, to literal royal peerage. He incorporated complex mathematical equations like pi to inject a universal consistency into his incredibly chaotic frames. He created anatomical drawings that directly mirrored Leonardo da Vinci's own Codex, and he utilized rhythmic visual repetitions directly inspired by bebop and hip-hop. By walking with all these multiple worlds inside him, he successfully collapsed the vast distance between the colonizer and the colonized.
Section 5. The Price of Genius.
René Ricard noted the paradox of Basquiat's success absolutely beautifully. He wrote, "Bomb style packages itself. At its purest, it's a tag, a perfect auto logo, the commercial art of the future." Think about it. Graffiti is inherently anti-establishment. It's illegal. Yet, paradoxically, by reducing identity to a simple trademark tag, it packages itself perfectly for the late capitalist art market. Basquiat found himself playing a necessary but ultimately very dangerous game of self-branding.
And you can actually see him commenting on this absurdity right on the canvas itself. He'll do things like overlay the literal written word "I" right over a drawing of an actual eye. It's morphological shorthand. Basquiat was just obsessed with the copyright symbol, stamping it on illegal street tags and million-dollar canvases alike. He's pointing out a really profound contradiction. You obviously can't copyright a crime, so what does it even mean to claim intellectual property in the first place?
It really forces us, as viewers, to stop and ask, what does it mean to own images and words in a world where ideas, and historically people, have been for sale? In Julian Schnabel's biopic, there's a moment where a reporter asks Basquiat, "Where do you get your words?" And he simply replies, "Everywhere." Basquiat took words from the public domain, literally from everywhere, and through the sheer intellectual alchemy of his name alone, he transformed them into high art worth millions. Ricard summarized the brilliant, overwhelming intensity of Basquiat's life by stating, "You could never explain to someone who uses God's gift to enslave that you have used God's gift to be free." Basquiat used his unique gift, his explosive, multi-conscious intellect, as an instrument of absolute, ultimate freedom, even while the art world constantly tried to cage him inside a stereotype. So the next time you find yourself standing in front of a Basquiat piece, you really have a choice. Are we finally ready to read the brilliant, complex codex he left behind for us, or are we still just looking at the paint?